In my history as a movie lover, I've always sought out and enjoyed games that deliver a cinematic experience. Games that let you off the rope and allow you to live the story as the main character. While experiences like this have become commonplace in today's ever-expanding game industry, things weren't always this way. And before the term open world would become synonymous with nearly every game released, there was a game called Shenmue. In 1983, a man named Yu Suzuki landed a programmer job at Sega. In his first year, he developed a 2D boxing game called Champion Boxing for the SG-1000. Sega was so impressed with the game, they decided to roll it out into arcades, and Suzuki was promoted to a project lead his first year with the company. Suzuki's next game would not only change his career, but arcade games in general. Hang On was released in 1985, a racing game that broke away from traditional controls, allowing players to immerse themselves in the action from on top of a motorcycle. This innovation was received extremely well, with critics claiming it to be the most realistic arcade experience ever released.
You know, nothing stood out like Hang On. When you walk into an arcade and then you see literally just a motorcycle thing that you can get on and ride in, it made video games more of a kind of entertainment activity.
Hang On would spawn what was known as the Taikon trend, where motion-controlled hydraulic simulators were used in many of the arcade games released in the late 80s. Suzuki's success would continue to snowball from there on. The same year Hang On released, so did Space Harrier, a 3DS shooter. Then in 1986, Suzuki's love of Ferraris would be found in Outrun. Suzuki calculated the position, scale, and zoom rate in all of his games in 3D, and then scaled them back to 2D, due to the hardware limitations of the time. His games were constantly pushing the envelope, and his eyes were always set on the future. He's been quoted saying, "I was always thinking in 3D." October 1993, he proved that to the world. Virtua Fighter hit arcades and blew minds. It was the first 3D fighting game ever made and sold 40,000 arcade units, and the port to the Sega Saturn the following year would sell over 1 million copies.
The number one thing that was huge about Virtua Fighter was that it was in 3D, and that was a big, big deal. And the other thing too was that nobody really thought that you can make a better game than Street Fighter as far as fighting was concerned. And they took a bold step in making this 3D fighting game.
3D was something that I was interested in for my days at university. In fact, my thesis at university was about 3D. I'd always been wondering what I could do with that technology.
Virtua Fighter's impact would stretch to famous franchises such as Tekken and Soul Calibur, whose creators are all quoted giving credit to Virtua Fighter as their inspiration. In fact, Sony staff involved in creating the PlayStation have credited Virtua Fighter as being the deciding factor to make the console a 3D machine. Virtua Fighter 2 released in 1994 and would use motion capture technology for the first time in the game industry. And by '96, Virtua Fighter 3 was released and was considered by many outlets as the most impressive graphical display in the history of video games.
The success of Virtua Fighter leads to inevitable spin-offs.
Virtua Fighter created a whole new pantheon of characters for Sega. From that, Sega created all kinds of games based on the Virtua Fighter. Virtua Fighter Kids, Virtua Fighter Master System games that are just like little storybooks.
The Virtua Fighter series has even been recognized by the Smithsonian for making great contributions to society in the field of art and entertainment.
That's a big deal, is to have something like Virtua Fighter be accepted by mainstream America as a real work of art or a real accomplishment in technology. That's something that we all should be proud of.
Next Generation magazine listed Suzuki as one of the most influential people in gaming history and are quoted, "Nobody has pushed arcade gaming as far as Yu Suzuki, and Suzuki just keeps on pushing." However, it was the 1990s, and the arcade experience was losing steam. The home console market was the future, and the major companies at the time were at war with their hardware. Sony had entered the industry with the PlayStation, and was giving Nintendo and Sega a run for their money. Sega decided winning the war required a killer app, a one-of-a-kind game that could funnel sales to their machine. And if they wanted to stay relevant, they needed to make something revolutionary. And who better to give such a task than their own Yu Suzuki? And of course, the company's superstar was up for the challenge. His first order of business was deciding what kind of game to develop. If the arcade experience was losing out to home consoles, then surely an arcade-style game wouldn't cut it. But perhaps he could blend the two, and take his most popular creation, Virtua Fighter, into a different genre. Suzuki had nostalgia for old role-playing games of the 80s, such as Wizardry and Ultima, and also spent time studying the newer RPGs like Final Fantasy. And in this, he found his genre. His new game would be an RPG.
流れを組んでその素直に進化した形のものを自分が作ってみたいなっていう気は昔からあったんですよ。
He developed a prototype early on called The Old Man and the Peach Tree. It would serve as a test of the third-person camera angle, combat, and storytelling systems. In this prototype, the player would encounter an old man in China, seeking information on a martial arts grandmaster. The old man would ask for a peach in exchange for his whereabouts. The player would have to find a peach and return it to the old man, who was found by the water skipping stones. Each skip of a stone would kill a fish, showing the old man to be the grandmaster all along. Footage of this prototype was never released, but it sounds like a chapter straight out of Shenmue, and we can assume the gameplay was very similar. In the end, the prototype was successful, and the project went forward. The RPG would follow the story of Virtua Fighter character Akira Yuki, and was initially in development for the Sega Saturn. Suzuki wanted the story to be a cinematic experience in the style of Chinese martial arts epics. He broke the story down into 4 themes: sadness, fight, departure, and starting afresh.
だから広く多くの人に遊んでもらいたいので、世界共通の題材なんですよ。愛すべき友を持てっていう一つのメッセージがあるわけですよ。今の時代にやっぱり本来の意味の友達とか、それが一番大事だよっていうことが何らかの形でその言葉の壁と国籍の壁を越えてそういったことが子どもたちに伝わっていけばですね、幸いかなと。
Suzuki hired playwrights, screenwriters, and directors to help him tackle the narrative. He had also traveled to China in the early 90s to research for Virtua Fighter 2, little knowing the trip would also inform much of Shenmue's development.
I didn't know very much about martial arts, especially Chinese Kung Fu. I had no experience at all, so I actually decided to take a trip to China and learn from the martial arts masters. I visited the Shaolin Temple, and all these experts taught me many things about martial arts.
The story followed Akira Yuki on a quest of revenge for his father's murder that would take him on a wild adventure through China, learning and perfecting his martial arts and discovering friends and lessons along the way, eventually becoming the man we know from the Virtua Fighter games. Originally set to release over 11 chapters, the first game would just serve as a prologue, setting up some of the characters and narrative. It was quite an ambitious project, right from the beginning. However, many things would change throughout the development of Virtua Fighter RPG, including the console it was being developed for, which was originally the Sega Saturn. In this time, Sega was struggling in the console race, and dumped most of their resources into their end-all machine, the Sega Dreamcast.
本当かい？
はい、セガが変わりました。変わった。
そうか。
セガが一番面白いよ。
いや、おじさんほっとしたよ。
嘘だよ。
大丈夫ですか？
爪が折れちゃった。
立つんだイカセム
Sega was looking at Virtua Fighter RPG and saw that Suzuki was doing something truly original, essentially creating the open world genre we know today. The game would feature fully fleshed out NPCs, a day-night cycle, real weather effects, plenty of side activities the player could engage at any time, an epic storyline, and some incredible graphics. Suzuki himself labeled the emerging genre with the acronym FREE, Full Reactive Eyes Entertainment.
違うジャンル名のちょっと考えました。これがフリー FREE ですね。自由だよ、制約が少ないよっていうものをエンターテインメントというのは娯楽ですよ。フルっていうのは完全とかまあフルスケールのフルと一緒ですね。完全に反応するという意味ですね。合図、目のことですね。目は左右で一つの対になってますし、現実と超現実もしくは仮想現実だったり過去と未来だったり、
Sega was so blown away by the world he was creating, they decided it was too good to share the brand of Virtua Fighter and needed to be its own original IP. Akira Yuki became Ryo Hazuki, and Virtua Fighter RPG became Shenmue.
Gaming started as something a small set of people played, and it's grown and it's grown and it's grown till now, like I said, it's starting to replace traditional medium, replace TV to some extent, replace movies to some extent.
Sega shoveled money into the project until Shenmue became the most expensive game ever developed, at a whopping $70 million. And in the final week of 1999, as the world prepped for a new millennium, a brand new genre of game was unleashed. Up to this point, the career of Yu Suzuki had been a story of ongoing success. Game after game, he impressed his company, his fans, and the critics. And now, after the release of his most elaborate, passionate project, for the first time in his professional life, he would be confronted with mixed opinions. The first chapter of the Shenmue story was set in Yokosuka, Japan, 1986. Ryo Hazuki is just a teenager when his father is killed before his eyes at the family dojo. A mysterious man in a Chinese robe accuses his father of murder shortly before his own.
Do you remember Chao Sun-ming? Chao. That's the name of the man you killed in Moon Swan.
The assailants leave after stealing an ancient Chinese mirror that Ryo's father was hiding. Ryo wakes up the following day, and the game begins. The objective is simple. Find out what you can about the mysterious men who murdered your father. Armed with only a journal to log your discoveries and a watch to track the time, you set off in your neighborhood with nothing to follow but your own intuition. The gameplay would see you asking people questions, waiting for shops to open, working a job, budgeting your money, learning new martial arts moves, playing arcade games, collecting toys, and slowly putting together the pieces of the mystery behind your father's death.
Day turned to night, night turns to day, and you're literally living in this world and experiencing this guy's life.
And while this was the groundbreaking tweak to the RPG formula, lending the game to its own genre, it was also the cause for its criticism.
It's a fucking bullshit forklift simulator for assholes! You people have been fucking fooled! That game was never that good. It was just a bunch of half-assed ideas put together in a way that you had never seen before.
GameSpot originally gave the game a 6.8 out of 10, citing the game was far from perfect, and saying by the time you're driving forklifts and participating in the game's QTE-filled conclusion, hours upon hours of boredom will have taken their toll. GameSpot has since revised their review and changed the original score to a 7.8. Game Informer is quoted, "Determining your character's next move requires little more than talking to someone who will then tell you who to see or where to go. All that's left is a guy walking around an amazingly detailed environment. If I wanted to experience that, I could see it in another game with proven endless entertainment value. It's called Life. Game Informer scored the game a 6 out of 10. However, not everyone was so critical of the game. And while it was the first time Suzuki made something that didn't have a universal appeal, Shenmue was still revolutionary, and that couldn't be denied. IGN stated, "It's a gaming experience that no one, casual to hardcore gamer, can miss." Eurogamer called it one of the most compelling and unusual gaming experiences ever created. Shenmue also sold very well, eventually totaling 1.2 million copies, becoming Dreamcast's 4th best-selling video game. Yet despite that astounding figure, the game was a commercial failure. Remember how I said that Shenmue was the most expensive game ever developed in its time? Well, that was something that shockingly wasn't analyzed very well. And even sales reaching over 1 million copies couldn't save it. Games Radar stated that every Dreamcast owner would have had to buy the game twice for it to turn a profit. So it seemed Shenmue was doomed to fail from the start, with only one silver lining. Some of the cost was also spent building Shenmue 2, and Suzuki and team could correct some of the mistakes they made with the original. However, the most tragic part of the story is yet to come. The Dreamcast had already been struggling in the console wars, and Sega had dumped so much money into the machine, and then into Shenmue, which pushed them further into financial crisis. And while the Dreamcast lay dying, a giant nail came slamming down on its coffin: the PlayStation 2. Just months after the release of Shenmue, the PlayStation 2 hit the market and was an instant success, totaling $250 million in sales on the day of its launch. Suddenly, Dreamcast, whose major selling point was graphics, was met with extreme competition. And while Sega beat out Sony when it came to textures and anti-aliasing, the PS2 would beat Dreamcast in polygon count, lighting, and particle effects. Not to mention the PS2 was able to play DVDs, which were hugely popular at the time.
The best entertainment system to hit the world. It's gonna be great. Plays DVD. That's a plus, am I right?
And featured backwards compatibility with the PlayStation 1. Despite being more expensive than the Dreamcast, the PS2 would roll over the console and unleash a mountain of games that enticed fans and proved that Sony was the future. And just 1 year after the release of PS2, on March 31st, 2001, Sega discontinued the Dreamcast and withdrew from the console wars. Not to mention, a little game came out in 2001 that sort of blew the lid off the whole industry. I'm talking about Grand Theft Auto 3, an open world experience where the player could truly do anything. Steal cars, cause mayhem, solicit hookers. The game was wild for its time. The graphics were great, the action was stimulating, the story was just enough, and it cast a shadow over what Shenmue had accomplished in regards to open-ended gameplay. If Shenmue had been likened to a slow burn, heavy, Godfather-type experience, then GTA 3 would be the much more digestible, maybe less artistic Goodfellas. Shenmue 2 remained in development during this time, and would release later that year, yet only in Europe and Japan. North America would never see the game on Dreamcast. Instead, Shenmue 2 was licensed to the new guy on the block, Microsoft's own Xbox. This was a terrible stroke of luck. If you played the original on Dreamcast and wanted to see where the story went, then you had to buy a brand new console to find out. And if you never heard of Shenmue because you never owned a Dreamcast, then you had to take a chance on a sequel to a game you never played. A pretty bad move in the end, and Shenmue 2 sold poorly as a result. Which is a real shame, because Shenmue 2 might be my favorite game of all time. It's the game that learned from the mistakes of the first, and expanded in a way that realized the true vision of the series. By the end of Shenmue 1, Ryo had managed to identify the man who killed his father. His name was Lon Di, and he was now in Hong Kong. The first game ends with Ryo setting sail to China. Shenmue 2 begins on the docks of Aberdeen, where Ryo once again starts with nothing but a notebook and a curious mind. I don't want to spoil any of the game, but I'll say the story is much more involved than the first, and so is the world in which it takes place. The game takes you to a few locations in China, and each of them are bigger and more involved than Yokosuka. You're likely to feel overwhelmed and even a little homesick, especially if playing the games back to back. However, the colorful cast of characters that Ryo encounters bring a sense of familiarity to the game's intimidating scale, and the world is rich with activities to get lost in. I've spent many gaming sessions simply arm wrestling, gambling, and playing darts. And of course the arcade is back, featuring a few of Suzuki's old hits. Shenmue 2 takes many more twists and turns than the original, and it's here where the scale of Ryo's journey can be felt.
この7つの光が財宝のありかを示している。それは一体どこなんだ。これだけではわからん。なんだと？流鏡の映し出す光と重ねることで初めて解き明かされるのだ。じゃあ王鏡だけじゃ何もわからねえってことか。一つだけ手がかりがある。競輪に行くことだ。
The player is truly a part of the whirlwind adventure Ryo has found himself on, a path that's been carved out since ancient times. And here, we see the vision of Shenmue coming into itself.
ゆったりたっぷりしっとりと大きめで多めでっていうのを次のゲームの中で表現したいなと思ったんですよ。世界観っていうのはきちっとしたものじゃなくて、その必要な世界観よりも一回りか二回り大きめのものを用意してあげると、全てにおいてそういうコンセプトですよ。
By the end of the game, Ryo is in Guilin, China, with a mysterious young girl, where we finally learn the meaning of Shenmue. And the ending left on possibly the biggest cliffhanger in gaming history, especially when you consider what happened next. Despite both games receiving mostly positive reviews and garnering a cult following, neither game was profitable, and the sad reality was that Shenmue was dead. Yet the death wouldn't come quick, and Shenmue would bleed out for years to come. Shenmue 3 went through an early development cycle on the Dreamcast, and remained in development hell for nearly 10 years. Early footage of the game can be found on the internet, and websites like Shenmue Dojo would report on all rumors and speculations, keeping the fandom alive and hopeful. Eventually, a strange little project popped up called Shenmue Online, which aimed to bring the brand into an MMO RPG. Footage and trailers from this game allude to the possible future of the Shenmue story, which includes some really out there stuff like this. It appears magic and mysticism eventually play a significant role in the story, as was briefly led on in the ending of Shenmue 2. Sadly, Shenmue Online would never see the light of day, being officially canceled around 2007. And serving as a nail in the coffin for anything and everything Shenmue. The great martial arts epic that us fans knew and loved and longed to see unfold would never be. And all the rumors of its return would eventually fade away one by one, and as the years rolled on, the hope faded away. And then when we least expected, a miracle was delivered on June 15th, 2015, on the stage of E3. The Shenmue 3 Kickstarter was an instant success.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Breaking records and becoming the fastest and highest funded video game project in Kickstarter history, reaching its goal of $2 million in 9 hours and eventually racking up $6.3 million in total. A remaster of the original games was planned by Sega to help bridge the gap between Shenmue 3's development and introduce new fans to the series. But the idea was quickly cancelled and instead replaced by HD ports to the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. Fans were pleased enough, and we were ready and waiting for Shenmue 3, but it wouldn't happen overnight. A couple of trailers were released in that time, and already some small concerns were brewing about when it came to some of the animations and character models. But most of us understood that this was a budget project, and knew the real juice of this series was in its story, and how we longed to see it progress.
Shenmue 3 a throwback experience or a modern experience?
そうですね。昔をこうモチーフにした今の体験。
Finally, after a long 4 years, the game was released on November 19th, 2019. And as tragic and unlucky as the Shenmue story has been up to this point, it somehow just gets worse. Shenmue 3 begins straight out of the cave in which the second game ended, and Ryo and his new friend Shenhua head towards Bailu Village in search of her father who's gone missing. The game is basically split into two halves, the first set in Bailu Village, which is a small countryside town, and the second half in the more metropolitan area of Niaowu, a riverside city deep in the mountains of Guilin. Shenmue 3 plays extremely similar to the original games, with a couple areas lacking, such as the fighting system, which in my opinion can be written off given the low-budget nature of the game. Yet the most lacking area for fans of the series was the story. The third game barely pushes the plot forward, and spends a lot of time rehashing things we already knew.
This is Iwao and Zhao Sunming when they were young.
And until the final minutes of the game, most of the story is concerned with Ryo learning certain kung fu moves so he can beat local gang leaders standing in his way. But during the game's final minutes, we encounter Lan Di face to face, and for the first time in the series attempt to fight him.
Lan Di. Fight me! I will avenge my father!
Quickly realizing that Ryo is nowhere near capable of getting his revenge just yet. Despite the backlash, I would argue the story is deeper than critics would say, and there were some interesting twists there near the end. It just didn't finish the story, which strangely seems that many fans were expecting it to do. Instead, the game ends on another cliffhanger, and the story continues. Shenmue, as any great martial arts epic, is broken down into chapters. The third game is the training chapter. It's full of dojos, exercises, and masters to learn from. Sure, the story doesn't progress that much, but I think it told as much story as it ever intended to. If the game had been made way back on the Dreamcast, it would most likely be very similar.
There are going to be multiple chapters in Shenmue 3.
そうそう。
Why not just wrap it all up with 3 then?
全部入れようとしてもいいものにならないが、ゲームとして面白くしたかったから。
Suzuki himself claims that the 3 current games are only meant to cover roughly 40% of the story thus far. If that's true, that means that Shenmue 4 would cover a ton of new ground, if ever released. Think back to the first Shenmue, which was an entire game dedicated to what most developers would breeze through in about an hour or less. And when you think back, we barely learned a thing. It was a full-fledged experience dedicated to a prologue. And this is both what makes Shenmue such a one-of-a-kind series, and also what makes it so widely critiqued by a world that just wants action and answers. In the end, Shenmue 3 was considered a massive failure by most. I even watched dedicated fans and Kickstarter backers claim to be done with the series, their frustration spewed about the internet. Some claiming they don't even care to play the next installment. And while, with great irony, it seems Shenmue 3 is the first game in the series to actually turn a profit, It also seems it would be the game to end it all. Years have passed already, and not a word. Just a letter from Suzuki claiming his loyalty to the fan base and giving his word that it's his life's mission to finish this story. So here we are, back to the days of rumors and speculations. But there was a glimmer of hope for the series. In fact, less than a glimmer, and more like a massive shining light in the form of Shenmue the animation. A sort of last-ditch effort to engage a new audience and get some hype and funding for the next game. And in the worst-case scenario, a platform to tell the rest of the story, so at least fans could finally see how Ryo's journey ends. But in the most Shenmue turn of events, the anime was cancelled after its very first season. Most of the fan base has moved on by now, and many detractors will point to the Yakuza series as a superior implementation of Shenmue's game design. And while I love the Yakuza games, I will continue to disagree. Shenmue is special, and in its own right wholly original, and not capable of replication. And those of us who bought in and lived this story thus far understand the difference.
I think Shenmue, to Yu Suzuki as well, is a culmination of all his efforts. It's a culmination of everything that he's done. And Yu Suzuki, who's a Renaissance man who enjoys art, music, all the good things in life, he put it all in one game.
And to the fans who felt the story should have ended with 3, or that it hadn't progressed enough, take a look back at the chapter cards and remember what kind of journey we all set out on in the first place. Remember who Yu Suzuki is, and what he has done in his career, and look at the misfortune that has straddled this series since the very beginning.
面白がらせるっていうのがアミューズメント、楽しませるっていうのがエンターテインメント。こっちから発信したもので相手がこう表情が変わって笑顔が出るっていう、それが見たくてずっと仕事してましたから、やっぱりそれをやってきて今こういう評価を得られるっていうのは非常に感慨深いものがありますね。
And my own personal message to all of you would be to not give up on this one-of-a-kind game, that in my opinion transcends gaming and becomes a tale within our own lives that we ourselves have lived. And I'll just leave this video with one question in mind. Will the series go on? Will we ever see how the journey ends? Or will Shenmue forever be the greatest martial arts story never told?